Gustavo Gomez-Mejia, please help me with your surname. I'm horrible with stuff later on. He's associate professor in information and communication science, University of Tours. An adjunct editor-in-chief of communication languages. Most of his lectures deal with the study of digital cultures, media industries, and the semiotics in textualities. He's the author of Les Fabriques. This is nasty. I can't read French. De Soi, Identité, industrie sur le web, les Numérique, comme, écriture, and a lot of other stuff I will never be able to read. I met Gustavo some years ago, actually, with my first Humanities project. No, for him, it was a kind of sad activity, was kind of a guest researcher in the team, and it was a life changer for me. Not as a guru, but as a methodology. Because, in our field, we have people that like to count, and we have people that like to read, let's say, or think. And Gustavo was doing something somewhat, for my humble origins as computer scientist, groundbreaking, which was actually reading social media, copy and paste them on a Word document, not everything, just exactly what he thought it was interesting. So no counting stuff, not natural language processing, blah, 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 really going into the practice, how people were using social media. And we brought together a short paper. For me, still is one of my favorite top 3 for the Hypertext conference in 2019, which was about stalking reading. Gustavo really wanted to put stalking reading as a kind of practice, which is not like the usual stalking, about how people actually was using social media and all the strategies to avoid to be discovered by their ex-girlfriend and so on. For me, it was incredible and mind-blowing. So I mean, for the first edition of Margins, I could not think of anybody else that can help us on opening new perspectives, not just on practice and stuff, in particular, blowing this Anglo bubble we have of authors, bringing a French continental perspective, which is much, much needed in London today, but also how to put in place a very feasible, sensible work program on very important and cogent topics. Gustavo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Alessio, for this very warm introduction. Plenty of pre-pandemic memories. So first of all, big thank you for all the organizing committee. Thank you for inviting me and for offering me the opportunity of doing this remotely in spite of the rail strikes. So thank you, Alessio, Francesca, Naomi, Michael, Jane, Caio, and Daniela. So I'm very happy to burst the Anglo bubble, as Alessio just mentioned, and share with you a French perspective on digital textualities. So I'll be doing this in 2 movements. First movement is in regard to what we call screenwritings in French. So screenwritings is related to écrit d'écran, which is a conceptual notion. And so it has nothing to do with screenwritings as in the movie industry or the film writing sector. And the second movement will be devoted to analyzing what I would like to call post-internet expressions, which are actually post-internet words. So I'm using an adjective that comes from an aesthetic approach. Post-internet is usually used for digital art questions, and I would like to apply it to words and expression from a French point of view as well. So there's 2 entry points on digital textualities I'm sharing with you today. And so think of this as a research journey with a continental fellow colleague. And I'm sharing with you some bits of archival work, media archaeology I've been doing recently, but also reflexive experiences, a testimonial approach of concepts and methods. So I would like to get started by some preliminary questions. So, quelques questions préliminaires. So this is like a communal moment for all of us, from all the experiences we've been sharing during the entire day, and the talks have been awesome and very thought-provoking. And I would like to ask you 3 questions. They can be handled as a small personal meditation. So first question, do you recall your earliest digital online experiences? Give you some seconds to think about it. Then second question, how did you become a researcher in this field? And third question, to which extent is the internet driving your appetite for new objects and topics? So this is like the imitation gong. And yeah, if you get to answer those questions, maybe you get to answer the what the heck are we question that was just asked by Leah in her talk. And it's very interesting to realize that as digital scholars, we share like a common experience. I think it is the experience of us being historical subjects, historical in many senses, from personal, technological, cultural point of view, to realize what our theoretical backgrounds and choices have been, and to realize that we all work on moving objects. So if I were to answer those questions, it would bring a very baroque answer, which takes me from a background like when I was a kid in a 90s kid in Colombia, in South America. And I fell into the world of the internet at the time, like downloading screensavers. That's like a very remote memory. And I was such a fan of screensavers that I even wrote to the national newspapers, telling them that they should recommend screensaver heaven. So that's like a very concrete background. And as an internet user, I eventually met theoretical pioneers in the French field of digital textualities, who I met at CELSA when I was studying. Years later in the Sorbonne, they have a school called CELSA. And I eventually became interested in French semiotics and tried to apply this semiotic approach to digital textuality. So it's been a journey, and it all depends on the context you give to your personal history within a technological history, within a cultural history. So I would like to share with you this encounter with these theories that were taught to me in CELSA, at the School of Communication at the Sorbonne, and the effect they had on my approach of digital textualities beyond all these personal souvenirs. So talking about écrit d'écran, so we get to the concrete theoretical proposal. Écrit d'écran, screenwritings, it was an encounter I had as a communication student at CELSA. I started doing research as a master's student in 2006, and I came into a reflection about what at the time was called Web 2.0, social networking sites. And I had these very zeitgeist infused questions. I started working on an amateur pornography website called XPeeps. And I was asking myself, who is that author that we get to see? How do you become a pornographer of yourself? And afterwards, in my doctoral thesis, I was thinking about identity on social networking sites, MySpace, on Facebook, and YouTube at the time, and asking myself which identity conceptions are at stake on those websites. And in the framework of CELSA, which is a School of Communications trying to apply a very post-structuralist Barthes Foucault approach to very modern, trivial digital media objects, I met this duo of French communication scholars called Emmanuel Souchier and Yves Jeanne-Perrier, who were doing research on digital texts and new media since 1984. And so they had already developed a conceptual framework for analyzing um, digital textualities. They had done it from their collaboration at the Centre d'études de l'écriture, Center for the Study of Writing, Paris 7. Afterward, we were working together in a telecommunications school, and they ended up collaborating within the GRIPIC, the research laboratory of the Celsa-Sorbonne. And it's interesting to note that they were not digital textualities specialists. They had a literary background. Emmanuel Souchier is a specialist in the works of Raymond Queneau. So there's like a lot of links to with things we've seen before today. And Maria had worked on Romain Rolland. So these scholars with a literary background were developing their own body of notions, écrit d'écran, architecte, signe passeur, petite forme, I'm getting there. But what strikes me the most is that they were doing these things since 1984. So how did they approach screen texts? How did they build their theories? So if we do a quick flashback, 1984, what were they doing in 1984? Well, they were working on texts from 1881, especially Souchier was working on Paul Verlaine's poetry, and in the Sagesse recueil, we find a poem that he wanted to adapt to a screen text version, and it turned out to be Verlaine sur videotext. So 1984, Lord Friedman, Emmanuel Souchier, they did an adaptation of the poem Le ciel est par-dessus le toit. And it's interesting that they were adapting it to the video text, which is the technology behind the Minitel, a very French technology that was a competitor, we could say, to other network experiences in France. So they did so within the context of the Centre d'études de l'écriture. And Lord Friedman would become later a web designer, but in 1980, there was like a speculative future. And what they did with the text is that they took the text of reference, the Le ciel est par-dessus le toit poem from Berlin, and they adapted it using the video text technologies and constraints, following an Oulipian, the Oulipo playful methodology of style constraints. So they adapted it into a rhythmo poem. They called it at the time, rhythmo poem, playing with the combinatory exercise of what they called a programmed haikaization, like haikus being programmed. And they did this kind of literary exercises on screen with the literary text. And they also, I'm showing you this archaeology courtesy of the Emmanuel Souchier archives. And they were also playing the S+7 translation exercise, replacing words with a further series of words in a dictionary. And they were also using the video text as a tool for analysis. So they could do hypertextuals analysis by choosing either phonetical aspects or, so here you see how to highlight phonetic reading of the poem, a calligram version, lexical analysis, so you get to see the nouns here, and manipulating actually the material text. And they even got to analyze the punctuation. And this is very interesting. There was commentary on the discussions about the commas. So what kind of approach we have from just analyzing the punctuation? It's a very infraordinary approach to what a text is, and even visualization of the poem. So when I found out that these theories came from that very remote background, I asked myself, what were they doing at the time? And I asked someone, Souchier, what were you doing at the time in '84? And he told me, we were just using hypertexts as heuristic tools for learning what a text is, right? Is that they're kind of Frankenstein nerds as well, using hypertexts to ask themselves more nerdier questions about what a text is. So we get an insight about the text being material, multimodal, in a sense that is close to Mackenzie, from what they read in their theorization. We get the sense of also texts in the context of intellectual technologies, close to Jack Goody. There's a graphic reason, and the screen reveals it. And there's an editorial dimension. We're very into editorial gestures. So the background of the screenwriting theory is also can be also illustrated with this Raymond Queneau adaptation. So they did an adaptation of a trivia game that Queneau had published in French press, in the French journal L'Intransigeant. And Souchier made a Minitel adaptation in the form of a game. So this is what it looks like. So you turn newspaper archives into a game, and it's hypertext, and you click, you do the next button, and you have questions, and then you choose your option, and envoi is enter as a key. You hit the key, and who was Père Lachaise, and if you have the wrong answer or the right answer, it's a very rudimentary hypertext, but the principles are there, and the consciousness of what the materiality of the text and the editorial gesture is. So I'm moving towards to the presentation of the main concepts of the screenwriting theory. It's a theory I got to turn into a handbook with Emmanuel Souchier himself and other colleagues, Etienne Candel and Valérie Jeanne-Perrier, in this 2019 book, Le Numérique, comme écriture, digital writing, which we published in French. And I think it's the first time we're doing this in English, presenting this very, very important notions in the field of French semiotics. So it's called théories écrites d'écran. Some people talk about technosemiotics or social semiotics of computerized media, which is a rather thick description. So let's get started with the first notion is screenwritings. So screenwritings were proposed by Souchier as a means of emphasizing the materiality of technologies. So we're thinking of the digital in terms of a screenwriting material practice. And what he wanted to do in his 1991 article is to recontextualize the computer writing practices into a broader, larger history of writing. So it's a very interesting gesture of opening the perspective to a very long history. For instance, we get to see how the materialities of the screen and of the memories, because matière, mémoire, matière, écran, that's what he's thinking about, somehow resonate in very, very remote archaic practices. So in his article, he'll go from the scrolling of a screen text to medieval rotuli, which are actually vertical volumen in a way, and how the screen will reactivate a cultural memory of ancestral reading practices. So that's a very original perspective in 1901, and it's all about making us receptive to an infraordinary semiology, asking ourselves what a page is, what's the role of the blank is, how rotuli, these roles being actualized, can we trace back the shape of windows to other experiences, for instance, here in medieval Bible, using the langages in a very structured way. That's the main statement. Think about the long history of writing practices and materiality. In a second article, Pour une poétique de l'écrit d'écran, Souchier and Jeanne-Perrier were inspired by a CD-ROM of educational CD-ROM in 1999, and they further conceptualized why the analysis screenwriting requires. So it requires a precise description of the materiality of the dispositif. So we're bringing in the notion of dispositif. And the aim is to develop a reflection of the new economy of science, writing, image, and sound, and to open it to the social processes of appropriation, interpretation, and rewriting of this new semiotic economy. So this is like a broader perspective. We're thinking in terms of material poetics, how shapes take place in a dispositif. It brings the question of a larger new semiotic economy. I think the present experience of a conference in remote via Zoom, it's a new semiotic economy as well, and the social practices surrounding these screenwritings as an economy. This is a similar article for French scholars. And I recall like encountering this notion of screenwritings and telling myself, whoa, I was supposed to think of MySpace, YouTube, and Facebook at the time in 2006, 7, 8, in a rather social manner, like, oh, this is the digital revolution. And when I encountered the notion of écrit d'écran, it was like all about approaching the materiality of the screen. And these screenshots are back from that time. Ceci est un écrit d'écran. Second notion is architects. So the notion of architects arises from realizing that the creation of a screenwriting is only conceivable using specific textual tools. So you cannot write on the screen without a textual tool. And so the text is somehow mis en abîme within another textual structure. And that's what they call an architect, Souchier and Jeanne-Perrier. So there's an architect governing the text we produce on screen. So we call architects, from the Greek root arche, the tools that allow writing to exist on the screen, and which, in addition to representing the structure of the text, command the execution and realization. So that's what they mean by architects, or the writing tools for screenwritings are to be considered as architects. It has nothing to do with the Gérard Genette notion of architects. Someone was talking about paratexts earlier on, and thinking of this Genette potential ambivalence. They kind of take a similar notion, but turn it in a different orientation. It's more about the standardization of texts that is operated by textual tools. So think of architects whenever you think of text formats, text templates, or default choices being made on what can you do on screen. And so it all comes up to a question of editorial powers. You want to write something on screen, but the screen is not a blank page. It has been set up by the default choices of the tool conceptor. So the architects reveal poetic issues and mask orders, and they determine the limits of the scriptable. Souchier and Jeanne-Perrier tell us. You have examples here like word templates, but I mean, without even going to templates, whenever word processor uses a capitalization style that you don't want, it's a conception of the text that it's kind of forcing upon you. They were thinking as well in the articles about webmails as architects, telling you what to write, how to write it. And they were also making links with a very proto-hypertextual, quoting a notion I heard before, the proto-hypertextuality of Raymond Queneau and un compte à votre façon, the choose your own adventure, which was also quoted in the syllabus talk, as a forerunner of architects, because you anticipate sequences of textual production and you give them like a combinatory exercise. So architects were very useful for my understanding of profile editors as authoring tools, for instance. So if you want to write your own Facebook profile, for instance, you can think of it as an architect. They give you a very, very rigid framework for producing your own text, which is no longer your own text. It's like a preset you're appropriating. So, ceci est un architecte. Ceci est un architecte aussi, for the pleasure of mise à l'abîme. This is the PowerPoint architects when I was making the slide. Third notion is passing signs. So passing signs in French is signe passeur, and they come up with this notion in order to conceptualize the semiotic approach of hypertexts. So from what we heard before, hypertexts tend to be conceptualized in terms of our macro structure, of a connecting structure between documents. From the point of view of screen writing theory, it's more about thinking of the local approach of hypertexts. How do you crystallize the links? So the screen is a unique space on which all this writing functionality is crystallized. It could be dubbed a unimedia. It all sums up to a screen, but within a screen, you have tool signs that give you access to different modalities of texts. So signe passeur or passing signs are the signs that allow you to move through the text on a single screen. But it's not only an issue of an instrumental function, but from a semiotic point of view, you can interrogate these passing signs from 3 levels of meaning. They have a situation on screen. You have to find where they are placed, either in menus or toolbars, for example. Passing signs also designate themselves as being clickable. So maybe is it because they're underlined, or maybe because when you hover upon the pointer changes into a hand. So they designate themselves as passing signs, and they also control access to the virtual text and the hypertext that is coming to the screen. So they have to give you also cues or representations about the text that is to come. So this is a very interesting way of thinking of the hypertext as being materialized on screen by signe passeur, passing signs. And it comes to the idea of reading, writing processes. The gesture of clicking is both reading and writing in a way. In French, Souchier discovered an older translation of literacy, which was lettrure, which is both reading and writing at the time, lettrure. So passing signs are used to conceptualize what is clickable on screen. And this is a definition from Souchier, Numérique, and Jeanne-Perrier in their 2003 book, Lire, écrire, écrire, which was published by the Bibliothèque du Centre Pompidou. So the signe passeur, I found on my way in my Facebook research years, all these bluish clickable items are to be thought of as signe passeur. They alter what you have on screen. And the last notion I would like to share with you is petite forme. Petite forme is like a self-explanatory notion in French. In English, I would go either with small forms or small shapes if you prefer. So it's a more recent notion that Souchier with Candel and Jeanne-Perrier came with when they realized that web pages became modular, that they were standardized and they were recurrent shapes that created a sort of a grammar for creating websites, by blocks, if you prefer. Maybe thinking about the WordPress CMS and it's all block editing. And so what are various writings on the web looking like a complex and assemblage of blocks of petite forme. So you can think of them as a matter of grammar, also in terms of design trends into a technologic paradigm. Think of drop-down menus, search fields, tag clouds, which are of vintage now, comment modules, social network buttons. You can add them as blocks on contemporary websites. And they stereotype the image of the text, and they give you frames for collective writings within textualization of social practices. At the time, they were observing, for instance, how mapping modules could be integrated within websites or tag clouds. But whenever you see the interface of Facebook or any other social media platform, you get to recognize the small shapes they're putting together. The assemblages of friends or the lists of connection of the posts or the stories, they all become blocks. And there's a literacy as well being trained. So that's a propedeutical moment in the conference. So I get to the second moment. This is my intermezzo. So that's my background, screen text, screenwriting theory. And I moved forward to screen-related works in my attempt to understand digital textualities. So it all happened during the Read It project, I think, recalling Alessio's memories. It was a project about reading experiences in Europe. And I was asking myself, how can we document contemporary digital reading experiences? In the project were lots of people dealing with reading practices in books, but it was a more rare thing to work on screen reading practices. And I was thinking, how can we document those screen reading practices? Are there any new ways of describing screen texts out there on social media platforms? So I kept my screenwriting framework in the background of my mind, but I came up with this idea of using words as entry point into this culturological approach of screen practices, thinking about internet language as a means to understand the culture. And what was interesting is that from a French point of view, I was dealing with vernacular neologisms that were marginal and then became mainstream in France. So it was also a very interesting process to analyze. I got to talk about it as well in the RISO conferences for those of you who are acquainted with this conference, and to publish that research in internet histories. So that's a background of how I shifted a little bit my entry points from screen text to screen related words without without rejecting the screenwriting theory in order to articulate the process and the semiotics of the screens. What I'm showing you next is part of this cultural reflection. It builds upon Benveniste and interest for languages in his vocabulary of Indo-European institutions, for instance, in what he called the culturology, a project of understanding culture through vocabularies. And it also builds upon what Alessio was mentioning in introduction, a very manual and artisanal methodology of making screenshots and doing close reading in the fashion of Walter's Benjamin chiffonnier rack picker analogy. So I feel always like a rack picker at daybreak, lancing with a stick scraps of language and tatters of speech in order to throw them into his cart. And my cart is my phone or my hard drive, and my stick, my rack picker stick, is my print screen key. So I make lots of screenshots, and that's how I approach these words that tell us news stories about digital textualities. So please allow me to comment briefly for perspectives. The first one is thinking about the word stalker. So stalker in French, it rises from celebrity or profile stalking, and it became broadly the surveillance of someone's life on the internet. If you believe, for instance, the Wikipedia dictionary, surveiller la vie de quelqu'un sur Internet. The surveillance of someone's life on the internet. So it's interesting to think of stalking or stalker as a perspective into contemporary reading practices. We have a figure, le stalker ou la stalkeuse, which is a figure of a user browsing a hypertextual archive in a hunt for personal content. And it's also interesting, and we found out with Alessio and Lucia Lupi in our paper from 2019, that the feeling is that of a reader who's a spy, who creates, while discreetly surfing these hypertextual connections, a tiny clandestine narrative. So if I get to characterize what Stolke reveals about digital textualities, it's like a larger cultural history of screenwritings being reimagined through hunting and then celebrity culture. And you end up having this confusion between life and text, which is very contemporary. You also get an ideological struggle for wandering online out of the feed of the nowness or the newness of the feed. I'm quoting Lupinacci's categories for temporalities of feeds. And you're stalking someone, you get out of the feed and you go back into the past, or you work out your way into the hypertextual paths. So you have reading and browsing skills which you use for reappropriating your means of hypertexts. And you have these very interesting fantasies of secrecy and unavailability. You get an insight of those from these testimonies when you read, for instance, that someone was stalking a profile, and then he clicked on a bit.ly link, and it took him to a LinkedIn profile, and the LinkedIn profile will trace your stalking. So it's like a nightmare for this person. Or here you have him in Spanish, when you're stalking someone, and involuntarily you like a picture from 5 years ago. You panic. And so there's a very high consciousness of not clicking passing signs when you're stalking. So here's another I find eloquent. Someone on Twitter, am I the one who has his own stalking ritual when I wake up? And so it's part of a ritual. I think of Hegel, said that the ritual of modern man was reading newspapers in the morning. Stalking could be thought of as a ritual as well. Very popular tweets. And also in terms of hypertext, when you create your own routines in a hypertext, if we get back to Keno's choose your own adventure diagram. Second example, I would like to quote is click. I find it really interesting to think clickbait as a telling word of what screenwritings become. You think of it in terms of really provocative links, and it ends up being somehow folklorized. Right? You have a word for it, is putaclic. So clickbait implies recognizing established subgenre of deceptive screen texts. So it's like a subgenre of screenwritings. And when you find the putaclic tension, it arises from a consciousness of sensationalist hyperlinks, but also of maybe avoiding the derivative web traffic. So putaclic is literally click whore in French, excuse my French. So in terms of what is interesting for the study of digital textualities is that you get a sense of a diffuse assessment of the click worthiness of passing signs. So you get to evaluate headlines, thumbnails, or players are worth clicking, worth being clicked. There's also perhaps an infraordinary feel of clickbait content modules. Like you have these sections of sponsored posts or links or ad banner zones. For instance, I know in French, Taboola or Outbrain, this clickbait content providers, and they kind of fall into the infraordinary feel of what a reading feels like. In terms of hypertextual theory, it makes me think also of Alexandre Semer's theories of hyperlink rhetorics. And I think clickbait exploits a completion desire between what Alexandre Semer calls a texte géniteur, like a janitor text, and a texte relié, the text which is related. And so you have to complete text and you have to click on it to complete it. And also, when you find testimonies of people complaining about clickbait, it is perhaps a testimony of a critical literacy for digital advertising. So people here complaining about sponsored clickbait that takes you to a page that is crammed with advertising, for instance, or people making screenshots of how ridiculous putaclick can be. So clickbait is another take on digital textualities. I find it particularly interesting when you think of literacies that people come up with these proposals of a new unit of measurement, the putaclick scale. And it's very interesting because you get to analyze what the punctuation is, what the use of emojis are playing as a role in the context of a screen. What would Douglas Engelbart, who was quoted before, think of putaclick? That's a question. And the last example I like to focus on as a word is doom scrolling. So doom scrolling is another interesting compound that is making us think of infinite content and also of compulsive consumption practices. So it is a variety of scrolling, specifying a prevalent temporary screen reading gesture. It started as a pandemic-led buzzword, describing both an embodied practice and a mood. So it's compulsive consumption of women on the internet, says Wikipedia. And if we mention the scrolling expression, we think of it as binge text consumption in the times of social platform abundance. So we're in a time of abundance. And it relates to the architects as they foment a discipline of auto-refreshing content and endlessly updating screens. So you get the feeling that we are kind of shaped by the architects that get you to endlessly binge read posts. They kind of ratify feeds, like social media platform feeds, as the hegemonic petite form for our miniaturized touch screens. So feed became the dominant form. And they also tell us how the distracted sensorium becomes the object of a mental or moral judgment. So there's a morality to these reading practices, and they kind of turn into a social panic. This is from the Tours, my town, my hometown in France. They 2 days ago, doom scrolling, the mechanism behind this dangerous habit for young. So sign of the times of qualifying the experience of digital textualities. And what is even more interesting is to find humor about doom scrolling. So this is a French translation, people writing, permettez-moi d'interrompre votre scrolling anxiogène. Allow me to interrupt your anxiety-inducing scrolling to inform you. And they post very, very different contents. So there are implicit jokes which tell us that if you understand the joke, is that the habit has been embodied. And so where are we standing now when we think of 2022 doom scrolling with 20 centuries ago and virtually, for instance? So this is like the two phases of research journey I wanted to share with you, starting in screenwriting theory and opening up to post-internet expressions. As a wrap up in terms of perspectives and echoing things that I have said before, I think that there are three main perspectives for us scholars in this deck called identity fields. We have to maybe ask ourselves what our position is when we face a historical textualization of social practices. So in our book with Souchier, Candel V, Jeanne-Perrier, we like to think of screenwritings and digital writings in the larger frame of a history of writing. So do we keep that history in mind? To which extent can we avoid becoming victims of cultural amnesia? On the other hand, we have to handle the fragmentation of niche research fields. So there was a meme created by Professor Jeanne-Perrier about the of internet studies papers, and we have all these entry points. So how we position ourselves in this dynamics of niche research fields. What are our entry points, and how do we position ourselves in terms of the ordinary lives of digital texts? So aren't we caught in a loop of trivial reinventions? I was very surprised to find that earlier on this year, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary considers scripturient to be like a word of the week. And I think a scripturient is like a good keyword for relaying what the screenwritings are doing to our contemporary culture. Scripturient meaning the urge to write, make the social media platforms play on the urge to write contents. And also, what do we do with all these emerging expressions that qualify everyday practices regarding screen textualities, shit posting, deep fakes, shadow banning, our colleague was talking about before, a millennial pause, or even if we ask ourselves about the word of the year being goblin mode, popular TikTok hashtag. So I think these are three dimensions of a problem that we can either witness or we can very consciously take a part into this collective reflection. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.